And as promised today, we've got Jonathan Klein from Building a Better Brookline. He's a co-founder, and it's a relatively new organization, but they haven't been sleepy, that's for sure. Jonathan, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
You bet. Let's start with like the first and most obvious question. What is Building a Better Brookline? What's the story? Tell us about the organization.
Well, Building a Better Brookline is a coalition, and we are a coalition of individuals who are involved in a number of different causes and groups around town. We say that we represent 6 important constituencies who have come together around the issues of housing affordability. You know, one of those constituencies is affordable housing itself, which is where my background is and the things I have been involved in. You know, another is racial equity and the concern about diversity and inclusion. You know, a third is economic development and the need in Brookline for more economic development to build and sustain our tax base and create a thriving and diverse economy and community. And then we also include people involved in climate change and climate advocacy, which is critical and has a huge overlapping relationship with housing and the need for more housing. Transit and the need for better transit that supports housing and supports the community. And finally, public health. You know, public health is a really important issue that relates very much to stable and decent, safe, and sanitary housing. So we are a group of individuals from all those constituencies who see the overlaps and the importance of the overlaps, and building a broad base for increasing affordable housing and housing affordability in Brookline.
So, throw in motherhood and apple pie and you got yourself a stew. Those are all great things, I think, for me at least. Hard to argue with any one of them. But you have some visions about what a better Brookline looks like. Maybe give us some sense for what you think we ought to be building toward.
Sure, absolutely. And you just said something that reminded me of another group that I want to distinguish ourselves from. There's a great group that I think you might have already interviewed called A Better Brookline, which is a group of mostly high school students that I think have been working on changing Brookline to a city charter form of government. I think it's a terrific group, but I just want to make clear it's not us. We are building a better Brookline. So I think what we primarily are in favor of is finding ways to increase housing production. And by that, I mean housing of all types, very low income housing, moderate income housing, middle income housing, and creating more density, especially in our transit corridors, where we think there is room for building substantially more both affordable housing, mixed income housing, and mixed use developments that will both be good for the people that need that housing. And we have a housing crisis at all levels in Brookline for people in every income level except the very highest, as well as good for the climate, because more housing and denser housing in transit-rich environments like Brookline is really, really good for the climate and for our carbon footprint.
Now, I'm going to diverge for just a second. You mentioned an organization with a similar name that does not have a particularly similar goal, A Better Brookline. But there are 2 other organizations which are also relatively new in Brookline, local sort of homegrown organizations that are also interested in the changing or the not changing of our sort of physical landscape. And those are Brookline for Everyone and, I'm just blanking. Brookline by Design, excuse me. And so I wonder if you could kind of run through Brookline for Everyone and how building a better Brookline is different from Brookline for Everyone.
So that's a very good question, and we are often confused. I would say that we are allies, for starters. I am also on the board of Brookline for Everyone, so I know that can be confusing to folks because I'm actively involved in both organizations. I would say the focus of building a better Brookline has been on this broad constituency building activity and working with our 6 constituencies and really building a very broad base. We're also much more focused on the transit corridors and economic and housing development in our key transit corridors, primarily Beacon Street, Harvard Street, Boylston Street and Route 9 are the focus of our activities. I would say that Brookline for Everyone is a more political organization. First of all, Building a Better Brookline is nonpartisan and non-political. Brookline for Everyone has a PAC, and so they have endorsed candidates. They recommend candidates in elections. They take positions on warrant articles. I would say it's I don't want to say a smaller group, but it's focused less on including many different constituencies and more on a group of people that are intensely concerned with housing affordability, zoning reform, and urban planning. I think that's the best I can do. But I love both organizations. We've had mutual discussions about whether we should merge, and we have come to the conclusion that we both occupy somewhat different niches and are both important to moving forward the cause of housing affordability. Does that help?
That does. Now, the other one that I'm curious about that is also relatively new is Brookline by Design, and maybe they have a different view. And I don't want you to spend a lot of time defining Brookline by Design, but maybe give us a little bit of sense as to how your organization is different from that organization.
Sure. Well, my understanding of them, and I can't speak for them, they should speak for themselves, is that they've come together a little bit more recently. We're new, and I think they're a little bit newer, that maybe they've formed in reaction to some of the things that Building a Better Brookline and Brookline for Everyone have been promoting in terms of suggesting more development and denser development and more affordable housing and economic development. I think they have concerns about the pace of development, is my understanding. They seem interested in comprehensive planning and a major comprehensive plan. It seems to be one of the things they're promoting before we, kind of do anything very significant. And that's my best understanding. I will say, I want to make clear, we're not against planning. I absolutely believe in planning and urban planning. We just believe that the planning that needs to be done is the planning in the context of our upcoming housing production plan, which I would love to come back to, as well as, neighborhood by neighborhood and corridor studies that we think can give us the information we need to make important decisions about zoning and housing development.
That's really helpful. I want to stay on housing, and I want you to tell us about the housing production plan and what the heck that is. But I also want to ask sort of the bigger question is, why is it reasonable or appropriate for Brookline in particular, the place that you and I both live, to add housing? Why not some other group or some other community rather? Why?
Well, that's a great question, and I would say two really critical things, and there are many more. One is we have an urgent housing need in our community, and by that I mean in Brookline and in Greater Boston. I don't have to tell anyone the statistics of how outrageously expensive and difficult housing has become of all types. Many people can no longer afford to live in Brookline or even nearby Brookline, and that creates real hardships for families, for individuals, as well as excluding a lot of people from the community we would like to build. Other communities are doing their part in a very significant way. Boston has actually per capita been producing a lot more new housing over time than Brookline has. And so we need to do our part to meet the regional need and fill the regional need for housing. So there's an urgent need for people that need a place to live, people at all income levels, very low and moderate. And we in the community, our greater community, need to be addressing that. That's one thing. The other really urgent thing is climate and climate change. I think everyone saw the report on Monday from the UN Climate Committee that said it's bad and getting worse, and it's almost too late, but it's not quite too late, and we all need to act urgently on climate. And one of the things about housing and multifamily housing in particular in communities like Brookline is that it's great for the climate. Building an apartment unit in Brookline is way better than building an apartment unit in a leafy suburb. I read a report recently that I loved that said that the equivalent, the carbon footprint value of an apartment in a community like Brookline or Somerville or Cambridge is worth 450 mature trees. That is the amount of carbon they absorb. You can save that much carbon by building a unit here instead of a unit in, and I don't want to pick on anyone, Wellesley or Lexington or, someplace where people have more single family homes, they use more carbon, drive further in their cars, have lifestyles that are just more carbon expensive. So to save our climate, we need to create housing near transit, near downtown, near jobs, where people can live in a much more carbon friendly environment. And that's before we even get to talking about fossil-free fuels, which we're working on here in Brookline. But let me stop there because I've been rattling on for a bit.
Great stuff. You had mentioned a housing production plan, and I know that many folks have no idea what that is. Tell us what that is, what the context is, sort of where Brookline is with respect to its housing production plan. Give us the goods.
Absolutely. So Brookline has a housing production plan that it adopted in 2015 and 2016. It was a 5-year plan, and it was a plan that was adopted under Chapter 40B, which is called the Anti-Snob Zoning Act, that encourages communities, towns, and cities to create more affordable housing. And when it was done sort of as what I'll call a defensive measure, because if we adopted a housing production plan, we got certain leeway in the pace at which we had to approve 40B developments, new housing developments that were using the 40B regime in order to get their zoning approvals. And it had a lot of really good ideas in how we could really address affordable housing production. A few of those ideas we adopted. For example, accessory dwelling units was a great idea, and town meeting has since adopted it. Other ideas we haven't adopted. For example, they suggested upzoning a number of our corridors where we could produce more housing. We haven't quite done that yet. So it was a 5-year plan. It expires in 2021. And the Housing Advisory Board, which I'm on, the HAB, has proposed, and the Select Board has approved a new housing production plan, which will hire an outside consulting group to assist us in planning the next 5 years of housing production. What we do and I'll go back to these things if you want me to, in a post 40B environment, now that we've pretty much met our 40B 10% requirements, and lay out a path we can use to build the housing that we need and that the community wants. Now, the last thing I'll say about that is the really important piece of it, and the first task under it, is what's called a community engagement process. And the consultants have a specific requirement to have a really good community engagement process. This is going to be about a 9 to 12 month process. It'll probably start sometime in the fall when the town signs the final contract. And the first thing they're going to do is really broadly survey the community and all the neighborhoods so that we can really engage, we hope, everyone from all of our constituencies and from other constituencies in talking about what Brookline needs for the next 5 years, and I hope 10 or 15 years.
That's helpful. I want to sort of pick up on economic development. You mentioned it earlier, actually twice. And man, that's a phrase that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people in a lot of different places. Brookline doesn't have a manufacturing base or an industrial base of any substance. We don't actually even have a lot of people employed in the town of Brookline. We have people who live in Brookline who are employed elsewhere. So what does economic development mean for Brookline in the context of building a better Brookline? What is the kind of economic development that your organization is interested in, and why? Why is that helpful or important, or, as you say, better?
Well, so Paul Sainer, who's the co-chair of EDAB, the Economic Development Advisory Board, was one of the co-founders of Building a Better Brookline and has been an active participant. There are many, everything you said is exactly accurate about our economic base in terms of employment and commercial activity. And we need to work on that in a lot of different ways. One way to work on that is through solely economic development projects, office buildings or biolabs, or the kinds of things that are happening down along the Route 9 corridor by Brookline Village. But another way to work on that is through what I'll call mixed use developments. Developments that if we upzoned and allowed more density could include, for example, commercial space on the first floor and then residential space above, or mixes of office and commercial spaces. And if we create the right zoning envelope to allow those to happen, we can create both retail and other businesses that could do well in Brookline, as well as more customers for those businesses, right? The more people we have living in our, and frankly, I'm talking mostly about North Brookline now, but the more people we have living in our neighborhoods, the more people there are to shop at our businesses and, you know, keep our restaurants open and keep our small businesses open and, you know, provide the, you know, the little bit of, you know, potential growth in that area. So it's not an easy task, but the kind of development I favor is both mixed income and mixed use development. And that's become, you know, very popular, you know, in many places.
So I share your vision there. You know, the idea that most buildings on Harvard Street seem to be one-story buildings feels absurd to me, seeing as it's walking distance from the B, C, D, and in some cases E line, and has the 66 bus, which is a key bus route with tremendous ridership. But in transitioning from a 100-year-old one-story so-called taxpayer building to maybe a 3-story or 4-story or 5-story building that is mixed use or even just all commercial, one of the concerns raised by my good friend Paul Warren is, well, what about the business that's there now? I don't love restaurants. I love this restaurant. There are lots of dry cleaners, but that dry cleaner is the one that I go to. And so how do we allow for these buildings growing taller while preserving what happens to be on the first floor right now, that specific business that is part of our community that we love? How do we do that?
Well, it's not easy. It's not easy. You know, we all love our current existing neighbors and we all love our current existing businesses and we want to see them thrive and survive. But it's very hard. You know, we can't ossify, you know, what's in the town forever. We can't say that everything right now is just going to stay the way it is, for the foreseeable future. So we need to talk about change and development, and then we need to find ways to mitigate the impacts, you know, to subsidize the businesses and relocate them that might get dislocated. And frankly, I even think to subsidize new businesses coming in, because one of the objections that's made is, oh yeah, you build a new building and it's 4 stories high and it's got retail on the first floor, but then the rents are going to go up by 50%, right? Because you're going to have new fancy space instead of the old space. And I would favor, you know, the kind of zoning changes that would reward subsidizing the kind of ground floor retail that we want, right? Both subsidizing the relocation of existing businesses so that they can survive that when possible, maybe not always possible. And then also from the development profits that we're going to create, let me back up a minute. When you create a new zoning envelope, you allow people to build more density, it creates more potential for profit. It creates more value in the land. Some of that value can go to the landowner. Some of that value should go back to the town by encouraging and requiring the people who build there to provide things back to the town, including subsidies for commercial residents, subsidies for some of the residential residents, so we can, you know, have 25% or 40 or 50% affordable units, and you know, figure out the right mix to make that work. It's not easy, it's complicated, but I think we can figure it out.
I love it. I want to ask you about public health. You mentioned it as part of this mix, and public health is this sort of area of study and of government that very few people had given any thought of exactly 18 months ago. But, you know, about 16 or 17 months ago, it became the most important thing nobody had been thinking about lately, except, of course, for people who work in it or study it or, you know, I'm sorry they got their day in the sun, as it were, and I'm sure they are too. But how does thinking about adding housing units or commercial space to Brookline tie into our public health? What's the pitch?
So we're really delighted that recently, so we used to have 5 kind of constituent groups, and now we've added public health, and Pat Marr, who is the chair of the Public Health Advisory Commission, recently joined our planning committee, and has written up something that we're about to put up on our website, which plays off the idea of affordable housing as a vaccine, or housing as a vaccine. Now, vaccines are very complicated these days, right? But we know that vaccines are things that protect us against public health risks. And one of the things we know about housing, safe, sanitary, decent housing, is that it protects people against all kinds of other societal risks. If you're homeless, you got a lot of health problems. You just do, right? And if you're living in substandard housing, you got a lot of health problems. You just do. And if you're bouncing from an apartment to apartment. So having good housing that is safe and affordable for families in need really is very helpful for the long-term health of the people that live there. There's a woman named Dr. Megan Sandell, who I think is at Beth Israel, but don't quote me on that. She's at one of the Harvard hospitals. And she has been promoting this idea of housing as a vaccine for a while, and it's really catching on. I also want to add one more thing, which is we are not just about building new housing, but we are also about improving and investing our existing stock of affordable housing in Brookline. We have a wonderful affordable housing community here. The Brookline Housing Authority, the BHA, owns 950 units and houses about 2,500 people and does a very good job with very limited resources. But frankly, some of the people living in that housing don't have less good housing than they should. And that's because at the state level, also at the federal level, but more at the state level, they have not gotten the resources they need. And so one of the things Building a Better Brookline believes is that we really need to find resources, hopefully state resources, but also potentially town resources, maybe ARPA resources from the American Rescue Plan Act, to invest in our public housing authority and improve the lives of the Brookline residents and citizens who are living in that housing now.
Well, I don't often take the bait, but I'm going to take it this time and mention that I led the way with the help from my colleagues in both the House and the Senate to land a several $100,000 bond appropriation for the Colonel Floyd development to build a new and more unit facility for older adults in housing. Currently, some of them have a flight of stairs to get into their home without an elevator, which is kind of crazy for housing for older adults. And I also got a several $100,000 appropriation, again, with the help of Representative Mike Moran, Representative Ed Coppinger, Representative Nika Ilogardo, Senator Cindy Cream, to help renovate kitchens and bathrooms in existing housing stock, because you're absolutely right. The state and the federales, neither has done enough to maintain existing stock. Select Board member John Van Scoyac has been pointing that out recently, and he's not wrong. And so there's work to do, and I'm glad that I've been able to help at least a little bit in that regard. But I do want to push back a little bit, and we just got a minute. So, for someone like me and like many of my viewers who have their own home and, they're economically secure and they've got their transit organized, I understand why it's better for someone who doesn't yet live in Brookline. But why is it better for the people who already do live in Brookline?
Wow, that's a great question. I guess the question is, are we the kind of people that want to lock the gate behind us? Or are we the kind of people that want to live in a community that is welcoming, diverse, and open and affordable? And I want to live in the latter kind of community. I want to be in the kind of community that welcomes people in. We think of ourselves as, I'll put it in air quotes, progressives. That's how most of Brookline thinks of itself. And it's not progressive to lock the gate behind us. It is progressive to really care about our neighbors, not just our neighbors in Brookline, but our neighbors in Boston and our neighbors in Brockton and Lawrence and around the state and around the country. I really believe in that. I think there are a lot of people in Brookline that really believe in that we have an obligation, to love our neighbors as ourselves. And so for me, that comes from a very deep place. And I think it can be done in a way that makes Brookline a better place and enhances the things that many of us do love about Brookline, which include the diversity and the character and the kind of denser and more integrated housing stock that we have. So I think that's really important. I hope other people do too.
I once read on a sign that more neighbors mean more fun. And
Yes.
maybe there's something to that. I tend to think there is. And of course, it should be done in a way that is appropriate and careful and measured and thoughtful. And everybody will agree to that for sure. Jonathan Klein from Building a Better Brookline, co-founder. Thanks so much for spending some time with us today. Delighted to have you on the show, and delighted that folks got to know a little bit. You've got a website. Tell us your website just before we close.
The website is buildingabetterbrookline.org.
Easy peasy, lemon squeezy.
Really
Buildingabetterbrookline.org. You're watching Brookline Interactive Group, which I think is brooklineinteractive.org. I hope I get that right. Let's find out. No, yeah, brooklineinteractive.org. I just tested the power of Zoom. You're watching Brookline Interactive. I'm Tommy Vitolo. Thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you next week.